hey friends, how does a life built almost entirely on restraint come to feel so deeply personal to millions who never met her? How can someone trained to reveal so little somehow leave behind a presence that feels quietly intimate, as if she were part of the furniture of everyday life, always there, rarely noticed, and suddenly irreplaceable? It's a paradox that lingers unanswered, and tonight we'll let it rest gently between us, rather than rushing to resolve it. Imagine a quiet room, somewhere in Britain, early morning light pressing softly against heavy curtains. The air smells faintly of polished wood and old paper. A clock ticks with ceremonial patience. Outside, the world is already awake, buses starting their routes, radios murmuring news, teacups warming waiting hands. And yet, inside this room, time seems to move differently, measured not in minutes, but in decades, in habits repeated until they become invisible. This is the atmosphere that shaped the life of Queen Elizabeth II, a life that would come to mirror the slow, steady rhythm of a nation itself. Even now, long after her passing, you can feel how her presence still echoes. In the phrasing of official statements, in the choreography of public ceremonies, in the almost unconscious expectation that some figure, calm and composed, will appear at moments of uncertainty to say just enough and never too much. Her life still shapes the way the modern world understands continuity, patience, and the quiet power of simply staying. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy drifting off to these stories of great minds. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling us where you're listening from tonight and what the local time is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor did not enter the world as someone destined to be queen. When she was born in April of 1926, the crown sat firmly on the head of her grandfather, King George V, and her own father was a shy, hesitant second son with no expectation of ruling. The future, as it looked then, was ordered and predictable, at least by royal standards. Elizabeth's place was to be near the center of things, but not at the center itself. Close enough to feel the weight of tradition, yet distant enough to imagine a life that might remain gently contained. She was born into rooms where silence mattered, where voices softened as they approached closed doors, where children learned early that listening was often more important than speaking. One clear historical fact stands quietly at the start of her story. She was never meant to be monarch. That single contingency, one abdication, one unexpected turn would redirect the entire course of her existence. Some historians still wonder how different her inner life might have been had that moment never come. As a child, Elizabeth was known to be serious, even reserved. Family members noticed her ability to sit still for long periods, absorbed in simple routines. One small, human detail often recalled is her fondness for arranging toy horses in careful lines, returning them to the same positions each evening before bed. It was less about play and more about order, about the comfort of knowing where things belonged. Whether this habit reflected innate temperament or early training is still an open question among biographers. Her childhood unfolded against a backdrop of subtle tension. Britain between the wars carried an unspoken awareness of fragility. The empire still stretched across maps, but its edges were beginning to fray. Radios brought voices from faraway places into living rooms. Newspapers carried headlines that adults read with quiet concern, then folded away before children could ask too many questions. Elizabeth absorbed this atmosphere without fully understanding it. learning perhaps unconsciously that stability was something you performed, not something you assumed. There was warmth, too, private moments away from ceremony, walks with her sister Margaret, whose laughter filled spaces Elizabeth herself rarely did, time spent with animals, especially dogs, whose uncomplicated loyalty offered relief from the carefulness of human interaction. She reportedly found comfort in routine evening prayers, not out of fear, but out of rhythm, the soothing repetition of familiar words marking the close of each day. Yet even in these early years, there were small wounds that shaped her inward life. The sense of being watched, evaluated, prepared. Tutors corrected posture, diction, expression. A misplaced word could echo longer than intended. Some scholars still debate whether her legendary self-control was a natural gift or a defense built early against scrutiny. Perhaps it was both. As the years moved forward, quietly and without announcement, the world outside her sheltered rooms began to darken. Political shifts, economic strain, and the distant rumble of conflict pressed closer. Elizabeth was still young, but the tone of adult conversations changed. Voices lowered, faces tightened. And in the midst of this, something else changed too, something closer to home, something that would gently but irrevocably bend the path of her life. For now, though, she remained simply Elizabeth, a girl learning how to be careful, learning how to wait, learning, without realizing it, how to carry herself as if the room itself depended on her calm. And as you rest there listening, you might notice how this beginning already feels familiar. Not dramatic, not loud, just a life quietly aligning itself with responsibility long before the weight of it was fully understood. By the time Elizabeth could read fluently, the world she inhabited had begun to teach her its lessons not through instruction, but through atmosphere. Long before anyone explained monarchy, duty, or history, she learned these things by observing how adults moved through rooms, how conversations paused when doors opened, how uniforms were brushed smooth before being worn, how even joy was measured, shaped, so it would never spill too far beyond its bounds. Her family life, from the outside, appeared impossibly privileged. There were nannies and governesses, carefully planned meals, and homes large enough that a child could wander quietly for hours without being noticed. Yet inside those advantages lived a peculiar restraint. Affection was real, but rarely effusive. Praise was offered sparingly, as if too much warmth might weaken something essential. In this environment, Elizabeth learned early that love did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived as consistency, as presence, as the simple fact that someone was always there when expected. Her father, known then as Prince Albert, Duke of York, carried his own invisible burdens. He struggled with a pronounced stammer, something that caused him deep anxiety in a world that valued public speech as proof of authority. Elizabeth watched him rehearse, listened to the pauses and repetitions, sensed the effort behind every sentence. One clear historical fact is that his speech impediment profoundly shaped his character and, by extension, his daughter's understanding of courage. From him, she absorbed the idea that bravery was not an absence of fear, but the decision to proceed carefully through it. At home, Elizabeth developed habits that reflected this atmosphere of quiet discipline. She preferred structured games, predictable schedules, and familiar settings. One family friend later recalled that she disliked surprises, even pleasant ones. A change in routine could unsettle her more than a scolding ever would. This quirk, her reliance on order, has often been cited by biographers as an early sign of the steadiness she would later embody. Yet some scholars still wonder whether this was truly temperament, or a child's way of creating control in a life already mapped out by others. Her relationship with her mother brought a different texture into her days. Elizabeth Boslein, warm and socially graceful, offered a softer counterbalance to the formality of royal life. She laughed easily, loved music, and believed deeply in morale, especially during difficult times. From her, Elizabeth learned how reassurance could be given without words. A hand placed gently on a shoulder, a smile held a second longer than necessary. These small gestures mattered. They became part of Elizabeth's internal language long before she would ever speak publicly to a nation. And then there was Margaret, her younger sister, vibrant, impulsive, and endlessly curious. Where Elizabeth observed, Margaret reacted. Where Elizabeth paused, Margaret leapt. Their bond was deep and complicated, shaped by affection and contrast. Watching Margaret, Elizabeth became aware of difference, not as something to correct, but something to accommodate. Some historians still ask whether Elizabeth's lifelong patience was sharpened by years of sharing space with someone so naturally expressive. Beyond the walls of her family homes, Britain itself was changing. The late 1920s and early 1930s carried a strange mixture of optimism and unease. Modernity crept in quietly, electric lights replacing gas lamps, motor cars edging past horse-drawn carts, radios stitching the country together with shared voices and news. Yet beneath this progress lay uncertainty. Economic hardship lingered. Political tensions abroad filtered into headlines. Adults spoke of Europe with concern, though rarely in front of children. Elizabeth absorbed these cues without context, sensing that the world was both stable and fragile at once. She learned that things could look solid while quietly shifting underneath. This understanding, never fully articulated, but deeply felt, would later shape how she approached change, slowly, cautiously, with an instinct to preserve continuity wherever possible. Her education reflected the expectations of her position, even if her future role was still undefined. Tutors emphasized history, languages, scripture, and etiquette. There was little room for intellectual rebellion or imaginative wandering. Still, Elizabeth found small refuges of comfort. She enjoyed reading quietly before bed, especially stories that followed clear moral arcs. She also found peace in routine prayers, less as doctrine and more as rhythm, the same words at the same time, night after night, offering a gentle sense of closure. One question continues to hover over these early years. Did Elizabeth ever imagine a life beyond duty? Some biographers believe she did, fleetingly perhaps a quieter adulthood, anchored in family rather than institution. Others argue that even as a child, she sensed the invisible threads pulling her toward something larger. The truth likely rests somewhere in between, shaped by moments too private to record. As the decade moved on, something subtle but decisive approached her family. A change not of weather or routine, but of destiny. The kind of change that does not announce itself until it has already altered everything. For now, though, Elizabeth remained a careful child in a carefully ordered world, learning, watching, waiting while history quietly gathered itself just beyond the walls. London in the early 1930s breathed in two tempos at once. On the surface, there was movement, omnibuses rumbling along their routes, shop windows bright with modest displays, a steady cadence of footsteps crossing bridges at dawn and dusk. Beneath it, however, the city carried a quieter pulse of unease, a sense that something unsettled lingered just below the routines of daily life. Elizabeth was still young, but she felt this dual rhythm instinctively, the way children often do, long before they can name it. Her days unfolded in rooms that seemed designed to soften the outside world. Thick walls muffled the street sounds. Heavy curtains filtered the light into something gentler. Fires crackled in hearths, even when the weather did not strictly require it, more for reassurance than warmth. The smell of polish and paper followed her through corridors. These interiors taught her an unspoken lesson, that the private world could be carefully controlled, even if the public one could not. One clear historical fact anchors this period. In 1936, when Elizabeth was 10 years old, her uncle Edward VIII ascended the throne, and then abdicated it less than a year later. At first, this seismic event reached her only in fragments. Hushed conversations, adults speaking behind closed doors, the sudden appearance of tension where there had once been routine. Some historians still wonder how much she understood in those earliest moments, and how much she sensed rather than knew. Before that turning point fully arrived, London itself continued its measured routines. Radios were becoming central fixtures in homes, drawing families together in the evenings. Voices crackled through the air, formal yet intimate, reminding listeners that they were part of something larger. Elizabeth listened quietly, absorbing tone more than content. She noticed how authority could travel through sound alone, how calm speech could steady an unseen audience. This observation would settle deep within her, resurfacing years later, when her own voice would be asked to carry reassurance across uncertainty. She spent more time outdoors during these years than many imagine. Walks through palace gardens offered relief from formality. Gravel paths underfoot, the faint smell of damp earth, the comfort of predictable routes looping back to familiar doors. She took pleasure in small consistencies. The same bench, the same view, the same moment of stillness. One humanizing detail often mentioned is her habit of feeding corgis small treats at the same spot each day, an act less about indulgence and more about ritual. Even then, she seemed drawn to continuity. At school-like lessons held privately, Elizabeth learned about the long sweep of British history, the rise and fall of monarchs, the slow shaping of laws, the delicate balance between crown and parliament. These were not taught as dramatic tales, but as cautionary ones. Stability, she learned, was never guaranteed. It was something maintained through restraint, patience, and a willingness to adapt without appearing to bend too quickly. Meanwhile, the wider world pressed closer. Newspapers spoke of economic hardship. Distant nations appeared more frequently in conversation, not as curiosities, but as concerns. Adults mentioned Germany with lowered voices, Spain, Italy. Words like tension and unrest floated through rooms, then disappeared when children entered. Elizabeth sensed that calm, like the carefully arranged furniture around her, required constant attention. The abdication crisis eventually clarified what had already been shifting beneath the surface. Her uncle's decision to step away from the throne, driven by love and personal conviction, rearranged the entire family's future. Her father, once content to remain in the background, was suddenly called forward. Elizabeth watched him change his posture subtly straighter, his silences heavier. From this, she learned another quiet lesson. That duty sometimes arrives without asking whether you feel ready. Biographers still debate the emotional impact of this period on Elizabeth. Did she feel fear, excitement, a sense of inevitability? Records suggest she responded not with outward drama, but with inward adjustment. She asked practical questions. She listened more than she spoke. She observed how adults carried themselves under pressure and quietly mirrored their composure. London, meanwhile, continued to move. Trains departed on schedule. Shops opened and closed. Life persisted even as its foundations shifted. This contrast between upheaval and routine etched itself into Elizabeth's understanding of leadership. You did not need to stop the world to acknowledge change. Sometimes you simply held things steady while the change happened around you. As you listen now, perhaps you can feel how this lesson settles softly. The idea that calm is not denial, but a choice. That steadiness can coexist with uncertainty. Elizabeth was still only a child, but the city, the era, and her family were already shaping her toward a role that would demand exactly this kind of quiet strength. Ahead lay darker years, louder disruptions, and demands far greater than anyone yet imagined. But here, in this interwar London between radios and routines, gardens and guarded conversations, the foundations were being laid, slowly and almost invisibly. As Elizabeth moved from childhood into early adolescence, the world's expectations did not announce themselves with ceremony. They arrived quietly, like an extra chair placed at the edge of the room, waiting for her to notice. Lessons grew more focused. Conversations around her became more deliberate. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sense of being prepared for something unnamed but serious settled into her days. One clear historical fact defines this period with unmistakable weight. After the abdication of Edward VIII, her father became King George VI, and Elizabeth became heir presumptive to the throne. From that moment on, the path ahead narrowed. Not dramatically, not with overt pressure, but with a steady accumulation of instruction, attention, and expectation. Some biographers still wonder whether she grasped the finality of this shift at the time, or whether understanding came later, in layers. She was not sent away to a traditional school. Instead, education came to her, delivered in measured portions by private tutors who understood the balance required. History lessons became less abstract. Constitutional principles were no longer distant concepts, but living frameworks she would one day inhabit. She learned how laws were passed, how monarchs reigned without ruling, how restraint itself could be a form of power. These ideas were taught calmly, almost gently, as if urgency might disrupt their meaning. Elizabeth's temperament during these years was often described as diligent rather than brilliant. She was not known for flashes of genius or dramatic insight. Instead, she showed consistency returning to tasks, revisiting material, refining understanding through repetition. One humanizing detail often mentioned is her habit of carefully rewriting notes until they felt right, even when the content itself had already been mastered. Order, again, offered reassurance. Public attention increased, though it remained carefully managed. Photographs appeared more frequently. Her posture, clothing, and expression were quietly corrected when needed. She learned how to stand still for extended periods, how to keep her face neutral yet open, how to listen without reacting. These were not skills taught in a single lesson, but absorbed over time through observation and gentle correction. Some scholars question whether this early training shaped her emotional reserve or whether it simply revealed a quality already present. Despite the growing seriousness of her role, Elizabeth remained, in many ways, an ordinary adolescent. She enjoyed riding horses, finding comfort in the predictable rhythm of movement and the wordless understanding between rider and animal. She laughed more freely in private than in public. She preferred familiar company to novelty. These small pleasures became Anchor's quiet spaces where she could rest from the invisible weight she carried. As Europe edged closer to conflict, the tone of her preparation shifted subtly. Speeches were no longer hypothetical exercises. Radio addresses were studied not as formalities, but as tools. Elizabeth listened to recordings, paying attention to pacing, pauses, and tone. She noticed how calm voices could steady anxious listeners. This awareness would soon become practical. The question that lingers over this phase of her life is a simple one, yet difficult to answer. Did Elizabeth ever resist her future, even inwardly? There is little evidence of rebellion, no dramatic diary entries or recorded protests. But silence does not necessarily mean acceptance. Some biographers suggest that her resistance, if it existed, took the form of meticulous preparation, a way of mastering what could not be avoided. Through it all, the figure of Queen Elizabeth II was slowly coming into focus, though she herself remained simply Elizabeth, a young woman, learning how to inhabit a role without yet fully wearing its weight. Trial and error unfolded quietly. A speech practiced too stiffly, then softened. A public appearance that felt overwhelming, followed by one that felt manageable. Growth came not through dramatic failure, but through accumulation. As you rest and listen, you might sense how these years form a bridge. Childhood was receding. Adulthood, with all its permanence, was approaching. And Elizabeth stood between them, not rushing forward, not stepping back, just learning how to remain steady as the ground beneath her continued to shift. When the war finally arrived, it did not burst into Elizabeth's life all at once. It seeped in gradually, altering textures rather than scenes. Windows darkened behind blackout curtains. Radios stayed on longer. Voices lowered instinctively, as if sound itself might invite danger. The familiar rhythms she depended on were interrupted but not erased. They adjusted, becoming more deliberate, more conscious. One clear historical fact marks this transition. In 1939, Britain entered the Second World War, and the royal family remained in London rather than retreating entirely to safety. This decision, made by her parents, carried symbolic weight. Elizabeth understood it not as a political gesture, but as a commitment to shared experience. Danger would not be avoided simply because it could be. At 13, she was old enough to sense fear, but too young to fully articulate it. Nights were the hardest. Sirens cut through sleep, dragging everyone into alertness. She learned to dress quickly in the dark, to move without panic, to wait. Even waiting became a skill. Some biographers still wonder how much these nights shaped her later ability to sit through uncertainty without visible distress. Daytime brought a different tone. There were visits to bombed neighborhoods, interactions with families who had lost homes or loved ones. Elizabeth watched carefully, absorbing how her parents spoke, what they said, and what they chose not to say. Comfort was offered not through grand promises, but through presence. One humanizing detail, often mentioned, is her habit of writing brief notes to herself after these encounters, recording impressions rather than facts, as if trying to understand how suffering registered emotionally. As the war continued, Elizabeth's role shifted from observer to participant. At 14, she made her first radio broadcast, speaking to evacuated children across Britain and the Commonwealth. Her voice was steady, almost careful. She spoke not as a figure of authority, but as someone sharing the same uncertainty. Listeners later remarked on how reassuring it felt, not because of what she said, but how she said it. Some historians still debate whether this moment revealed innate leadership or simply reflected the careful training she had absorbed for years. Behind the scenes, Elizabeth remained an adolescent with ordinary frustrations. She disliked idle time, yet resented being protected from risk. She wanted to contribute meaningfully, not symbolically. This tension between usefulness and restraint became one of the defining conflicts of her youth. Whether she ever expressed this frustration openly remains unclear, but it surfaces repeatedly in recollections from those around her. Eventually, she was allowed to train with the Auxiliary Territorial Service, learning mechanics and basic vehicle maintenance. Grease under her fingernails, unfamiliar tools in hand, these experiences grounded her. One quirky detail stands out. She reportedly enjoyed the satisfaction of fixing something concrete, something that responded immediately to effort. For a life otherwise shaped by long timelines and abstract duty, this work offered clarity. As you lie listening, you might notice how these war years sharpened Elizabeth's understanding of service. It was no longer theoretical. It involved inconvenience, repetition, and quiet endurance. The war did not make her dramatic. It made her steady. And in a world that often felt unsteady, that quality began to matter more than anyone yet realized. By the later years of the war, Elizabeth had grown into a young woman whose inner life was shaped as much by what she held back as by what she expressed. The urgency of the moment had accelerated her education, but it had also clarified something quieter. That duty, once accepted, rarely loosens its grip. It simply changes form. Her days became more structured, more purposeful. Training with the Auxiliary Territorial Service was not merely symbolic. She learned how engines worked, how to diagnose faults, how to follow systems step by step until the machine responded. One clear historical fact stands firm here. She became the first female member of the royal family to serve in the armed forces. Yet what mattered more to her than the milestone was the work itself. There was comfort in tasks that had beginnings and endings, in problems that could be solved with patience and attention. One small human detail often recalled is how she took pride in her uniform, maintaining it carefully, even when it bore the marks of use. It was not vanity, but respect for the role, for the people beside her, for the seriousness of the moment. Some biographers still wonder whether this attention to detail reflected her inner need for control, or her desire to belong fully rather than hover above. As the war edged toward its conclusion, Elizabeth's public presence expanded again. Appearances were more frequent. Expectations grew clearer. She began to understand that her life would not be divided neatly between private and public selves. Instead, they would overlap, sometimes uncomfortably. This realization did not produce visible resistance. If anything, it seemed to settle her more deeply into preparation. Victory in Europe brought celebration, relief, and a kind of collective exhale. Elizabeth and her sister famously slipped into the crowds anonymously, walking among strangers who were laughing, singing, and crying all at once. It was a rare moment of freedom of blending in, rather than standing apart. Later reflections suggest she remembered this night vividly, not for its excitement, but for the sense of shared humanity. Some scholars still ask whether this brief anonymity strengthened her empathy for ordinary life, or simply reminded her of how fleeting such moments would always be. With peace came new responsibilities. The focus shifted from survival to rebuilding. Elizabeth listened as discussions turned toward housing, economy, and the reshaping of a world irrevocably changed. She noticed how leadership after crisis required a different, toneless rallying, more patience. This subtle shift stayed with her. Privately, she continued to seek grounding in familiar routines. Evening prayers, writing letters by hand, time with horses and dogs whose needs were immediate and uncomplicated. These habits offered relief from abstraction. In a life increasingly defined by symbolism, they provided reality. The open question that lingers over this period is deceptively simple. Did Elizabeth feel ready? Records suggest she felt prepared, but readiness is not the same as desire. Some biographers believe she accepted her future not with enthusiasm, but with calm resolve. Others argue that her sense of purpose deepened precisely because the world had shown her how fragile order could be. As you listen, you might feel how this stage of her life carries a quiet turning point. The war had stripped away illusions, leaving behind clarity. Elizabeth was no longer being shaped by possibility. She was being shaped by inevitability and learning, steadily, how to meet it without haste or complaint. Peace altered the pace of Elizabeth's life, but not its direction. With the war's end came a gentler atmosphere, a loosening of constant alertness, yet responsibility did not recede. It simply changed its posture, standing closer now, less theoretical than before. In these years, one relationship moved quietly to the center of her inner world, shaping not only her private happiness, but the structure of her future. Her partnership with Philip. They had met earlier, in the careful, supervised way of royal introductions, but it was after the war that their connection deepened. Philip was different from the men Elizabeth was accustomed to: direct, restless, and less inclined toward ceremony. Where she measured, he moved. Where she listened, he spoke. One clear historical fact grounds this period. Elizabeth and Philip married in 1947, a union that would last more than 7 decades. Yet the significance of their marriage lay not only in longevity, but in the ongoing negotiation it required. For Elizabeth, marriage did not offer escape from duty. It complicated it. She was heir to the throne, already bound to a role that allowed little flexibility. Philip, meanwhile, carried his own ambitions and sense of self. Balancing these two trajectories demanded patience and compromise skills Elizabeth had been practicing all her life, now tested in the most personal way. One humanizing detail often recalled is how they developed small, private rituals to preserve a sense of normality. Shared breakfasts when schedules allowed, walks that avoided crowds, quiet jokes exchanged during formal events, invisible to most observers. These moments mattered. They offered intimacy within an existence largely lived in public view. Yet there were frictions. Philip was asked to relinquish aspects of his career and identity to fit within the monarchy's framework. Elizabeth, for her part, had to integrate partnership into a life already governed by institution. Some biographers still wonder how fully either of them anticipated the sacrifices involved, or whether those realities only revealed themselves gradually, through years rather than decisions. Publicly, the marriage was framed as a hopeful symbol for a nation emerging from hardship. There were crowds, pageantry, a sense of renewal. Privately, Elizabeth was navigating a new dimension of responsibility, learning how to share her inner life without surrendering the composure that defined her public self. It was a delicate balance, and one she approached not through declarations, but through adjustment. As you rest and listen, you might feel how this chapter carries a different texture. The conflicts here are quieter, more inward. Not battles of nations, but negotiations of daily life whose needs come first. How independence is preserved, how love adapts when it must coexist with permanence. This partnership would become one of the few spaces where Elizabeth could be fully herself, even as it demanded continual recalibration. And as the years moved forward, the demands of her role would soon expand again, calling her not just to represent continuity, but to embody it entirely. Marriage brought warmth into Elizabeth's life, but it did not soften the structure around it. Instead, it revealed how little space there truly was between the personal and the public. Almost immediately, domestic rhythms had to learn how to coexist with institutional time calendars planned years ahead, obligations that arrived without regard for mood or fatigue. Elizabeth adapted as she always had, quietly, methodically, without announcing the effort it required. Motherhood arrived during this period, adding another layer of responsibility to an already dense life. One clear historical fact marks the moment. Her first child, Charles, was born in 1948, followed by Anne 2 years later. These were deeply human milestones, filled with the ordinary vulnerabilities of new parenthood. Yet even here, Elizabeth's experience was shaped by constraint. Nannies were present, schedules were fixed, privacy was partial. Some biographers still wonder how she reconciled the instinct to protect and nurture with a role that demanded frequent absence. She found comfort in routine once again. Early mornings, brief, focused moments with her children before the day unfolded. Letters written by hand when travel separated them. One small, humanizing detail, often mentioned, is her habit of keeping photographs close on desks, in personal folders, glimpses of family life that anchored her amid abstraction. These were not displays for others. They were reminders for herself. At the same time, Elizabeth's public duties expanded steadily. Tours across the Commonwealth introduced her to landscapes and cultures far removed from palace corridors. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing tone, custom, and expectation. The institution she represented was ancient, but the world she was moving through was changing rapidly. Some scholars still ask whether she sensed, even then, how much adaptation would be required to preserve continuity. The tension between motherhood and monarchy never resolved neatly. Elizabeth did not attempt to merge them into a single narrative. Instead, she compartmentalized, holding each with care, but rarely allowing one to intrude upon the other. This approach drew both admiration and criticism in later years. Was it discipline or distance? Commitment or cost? The question remains open, shaped by perspective as much as evidence. As you listen now, you may notice how this phase carries a quiet heaviness. There are no dramatic confrontations, no public crisis. Just the steady accumulation of roles: wife, mother, heir, each demanding presence, each limiting it. Elizabeth moved through these constraints, not by reshaping them, but by learning how to live precisely within their edges. These years did not announce themselves as a turning point, yet they prepared her for one. Because even as she learned to balance domestic life with public service, another shift was approaching, one that would dissolve the remaining distance between preparation and permanence. The moment Elizabeth had been preparing for, without ever truly rehearsing, arrived quietly, as many defining moments do. There was no dramatic announcement, no ceremonial warning, just a sudden stillness, followed by the realization that the ground beneath her life had shifted, finally and irrevocably. One clear historical fact anchors this turning point. In February 1952, while Elizabeth was on tour in Kenya, her father, King George VI, died in his sleep. She was 25 years old. In a single night, she crossed an invisible threshold, from daughter to sovereign, from preparation to permanence. Those who were with her later recalled the simplicity of how the news was delivered and the silence that followed. There were no theatrics, only acceptance. Elizabeth's response was immediate and contained. She returned to Britain, not as a grieving daughter alone, but as queen. There was little space to linger inside personal loss. Protocol moved forward. Decisions needed to be made. Words needed to be chosen carefully. Some biographers still wonder what that first private moment felt like, whether shock arrived before resolve, or whether resolve itself acted as a shield against shock. In the days that followed, Elizabeth learned the practical reality of sovereignty. Her signature changed. Her name, in official use, shifted subtly. Rooms she had once entered as a guest were now hers by responsibility. The red boxes of government papers began to arrive daily, each one demanding attention regardless of emotion or circumstance. One humanizing detail from this period, often mentioned, is her preference for reading these documents late in the evening, when the house was quieter and the weight of interruption lifted slightly. Night offered space to think. Grief, meanwhile, was largely private. Public mourning followed, prescribed forms solemn, restrained, dignified. Elizabeth participated fully, yet held her own sorrow close. This separation between inner life and outer duty would become a defining feature of her reign. Whether it was a coping mechanism or a conscious choice remains an open question among historians. Philip, now consort rather than independent naval officer, walked beside her through this transition. The shift required its own recalibration. Elizabeth was no longer balancing preparation with partnership. She was balancing authority with intimacy. Their private negotiations, rarely documented, shaped the emotional architecture of her reign. Some scholars suggest that these early adjustments were among the most difficult of her life, precisely because they had to be made quietly. As queen, Elizabeth did not seek to redefine the monarchy. Instead, she stepped into it fully, accepting its limits as much as its privileges. Her first weeks were marked not by bold declarations, but by careful listening. She met with ministers, advisors, and officials, absorbing information steadily rather than dramatically. Continuity, she seemed to understand, would be her first service. As you listen now, you might feel how this section carries a deeper stillness. The narrative slows, not because events cease, but because meaning concentrates. Elizabeth had crossed the point of no return. The crown, once a distant possibility, now rested fully upon her life. And from this moment forward, every choice spoken or silent would ripple far beyond the room in which it was made. The months that followed Elizabeth's accession unfolded with a careful gravity, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Grief had not yet settled, but ceremony could not wait. The crown demanded visibility. And so preparation began for an event that would place ancient symbols onto a young woman still learning how to carry them. One clear historical fact defines this chapter. Elizabeth's coronation took place in June 1953, and it was the first coronation ever to be fully televised. This single decision, quietly debated, cautiously approved, shifted the relationship between monarchy and public life. Suddenly, a ritual once reserved for those physically present would unfold inside ordinary living rooms, framed by curtains and teacups, watched by millions who had never before seen such intimacy. For Elizabeth, the coronation was not experienced as spectacle. It was choreography. Weight, sequence, patience. The crown itself was heavier than expected, its pressure a physical reminder of permanence. The robes restricted movement. The cathedral air was thick with incense and history. Each step followed centuries of precedent, leaving little room for personal interpretation. Some biographers still wonder what she felt beneath the layers, whether awe overpowered fear, or whether focus itself became a kind of refuge. Privately, she prepared with the same methodical calm that had defined her life so far. She practiced walking in weighted shoes to adjust to the crown. She rehearsed movements until they became muscle memory. One small, humanizing detail often noted is her concern about kneeling correctly without appearing strained, a worry not about appearance, but about composure. The goal was not perfection, but steadiness. The day itself moved slowly, deliberately. Voices echoed upward. Music rose and fell like breath. Elizabeth's face, watched closely by cameras and crowds alike, remained composed, serene, without being distant. To many viewers, this image became iconic. A young queen, framed by ancient ritual, bridging old authority and new technology. Some scholars still ask whether the televised coronation strengthened the monarchy by inviting closeness, or subtly eroded mystique by removing distance. After the ceremony, life did not return to normal, because normal had been redefined. The crown was no longer an idea or an event. It was routine. Elizabeth returned to paperwork, audiences, and decisions that carried consequences far beyond ceremony. The pageantry faded, but the responsibility remained. As you listen now, you may notice how this moment feels both vast and strangely quiet. A turning point not marked by emotion spilling outward, but by its settling inward. Elizabeth had been seen, crowned, affirmed, and then, almost immediately, she returned to work. This rhythm public ritual followed by private duty would become the pattern of her reign. The coronation was not a culmination. It was a beginning. And from here, the long, steady work of continuity truly began. Once the coronation's echoes had faded, Elizabeth's days settled into a pattern so consistent it almost disappeared from view. There were no trumpets to announce it, no grand gestures to mark the beginning of each morning. Instead, there were papers neatly arranged, precisely ordered, waiting in red leather boxes that arrived with dependable regularity. This, more than any ceremony, became the texture of her reign. One clear historical fact defines this phase of her life. From the early 1950s onward, Elizabeth met weekly with her prime ministers, regardless of party, crisis, or personal circumstance. These meetings were private, unrecorded, and constitutionally neutral. She listened. She asked questions. She rarely revealed opinion. What passed between them stayed between them. Some biographers still wonder how much influence lived in those silences, and how much was simply the power of attentive presence. Her daily routine was famously disciplined. Mornings began early, often with solitary reading before breakfast. Government papers followed foreign affairs, domestic policy, correspondence from across the Commonwealth. Elizabeth approached them not as ideological puzzles, but as responsibilities requiring care. One humanizing detail often mentioned is her habit of annotating documents in pencil rather than ink, as if even her marks needed to remain reversible. Public audiences followed. Diplomats, officials, visitors from distant countries, each encounter governed by protocol, yet subtly shaped by her tone. She had learned how to put people at ease without becoming informal, how to offer attention without intimacy. These were skills refined over years, now applied endlessly, quietly. Behind this calm exterior, the world was changing rapidly. The post-war decades brought decolonization, social reform, and shifting definitions of power. The empire she had been born into was becoming something else entirely. Elizabeth did not resist these changes openly. Instead, she adjusted the language of monarchy to accommodate them. Words like empire softened into commonwealth. Ceremonies evolved without drawing attention to their evolution. Some scholars still debate whether this adaptability was strategic insight or instinctive preservation. Her private life remained carefully protected. Evenings often returned to familiar comforts: walking dogs, reading, time with family when possible. These moments were not escapes so much as recalibrations, ways of reminding herself that identity could still exist outside institution, even if briefly. One small, telling habit from this period was her preference for simple meals when dining privately, a contrast to the elaborate banquets she hosted publicly. As you rest and listen, you might feel how this section carries a different kind of weight. There is no single crisis here, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, there is endurance. The slow accumulation of days in which steadiness itself becomes the achievement. Elizabeth learned that leadership, at this level, was less about decision than about continuity, about showing up, listening, and remaining. The open question that lingers is subtle, but persistent. How did she hold so much without letting it show? Was composure a shield, or simply the natural shape of her character? The answer remains elusive, folded into routines that, by design, left little trace. As the years moved forward, the faces across Elizabeth's desk changed with regularity, even as the desk itself did not. Prime ministers came and went, each carrying their own urgency, convictions, and sense of history pressing in on them. Elizabeth remained the constant. One clear historical fact underscores this continuity. Over the course of her reign, she would work with 15 British prime ministers, beginning with Winston Churchill and ending decades later with leaders shaped by entirely different worlds. These weekly audiences followed a rhythm as dependable as breathing. The room was familiar, the exchange restrained. Elizabeth listened with a focus that could feel disarming. She asked questions that were precise rather than pointed, clarifying rather than challenging. It was not her role to instruct, but to understand. Some prime ministers later remarked that these conversations forced them to think more carefully, not because she argued, but because she paid such close attention. Behind the formality, subtle dynamics unfolded. Churchill, already a towering figure of history, treated the young queen with a mixture of deference and paternal warmth. Later leaders approached her differently, some confidently, some cautiously. Elizabeth adapted to each without altering herself. This flexibility became one of her quiet strengths. Some biographers still wonder whether she consciously adjusted her demeanor to steady those who came before her, or whether this was simply the natural outcome of her deep familiarity with restraint. Beyond Britain, Elizabeth's role extended across a rapidly transforming Commonwealth. Former colonies were redefining themselves as independent nations, negotiating new identities that did not always align neatly with inherited symbols. Elizabeth traveled extensively, meeting leaders whose experiences and expectations differed profoundly from those of earlier generations. She listened, she observed, she allowed space for difference. One humanizing detail from these tours often recalled is her careful attention to names and customs, an effort that signaled respect even when political realities were complex. These decades were not without tension. Crises arose: economic challenges, political unrest, shifting social values. Elizabeth did not address them directly, yet her presence threaded through them all. Speeches were drafted with meticulous care, each phrase weighed for balance. Even silence became meaningful. Some scholars still debate how much power resides in such neutrality, and whether it steadies a nation or distances it from change. Privately, Elizabeth continued to rely on familiar anchors. Horses, dogs, and routine offered relief from abstraction. There was comfort in tasks that did not require interpretation, feeding animals, walking familiar paths, reading quietly at night. These moments restored equilibrium. As you listen now, you may sense how this phase of her life illustrates a particular kind of influence, not forceful, not directive, but persistent. A reminder that leadership can exist not in the shaping of events, but in the way one bears witness to them, consistently, attentively, without haste. Travel became one of the quiet constants of Elizabeth's middle years, carrying her far beyond the familiar corridors of her residences and into climates, cultures, and histories that challenged the old assumptions of empire. Planes lifted her across oceans. Ships traced slower routes between ports that once flew the same flag, now charting their own courses. Each arrival carried ceremony, but beneath it lay something more delicate, the careful work of listening. One clear historical fact grounds this chapter of her life. Elizabeth became the most widely traveled monarch in British history, visiting well over 100 countries during her reign. These journeys were not ornamental. They were acts of presence, designed to signal continuity while acknowledging change. The Commonwealth she represented was no longer a hierarchy, but a network uneven, evolving, and sometimes fragile. In these places, Elizabeth paid attention to small things. How people greeted one another. Which words were chosen in translation. When to pause before speaking. One humanizing detail, often noted by aides, is her habit of reviewing cultural notes late into the night, committing names and customs to memory so she would not misstep the next day. Respect, she seemed to understand, was built from details. Yet these tours were not without strain. The demands of constant movement weighed heavily. Time zones blurred. Privacy thinned. The same questions followed her from continent to continent, even as answers grew more complex. Some biographers still wonder how she maintained her composure through the exhaustion. Whether it came from discipline alone, or from an internal acceptance that rest, like control, would always be partial. The political landscape beneath these journeys shifted continuously. Newly independent nations balanced gratitude with distance, history with aspiration. Elizabeth did not attempt to bind them too tightly to the past. Instead, she spoke of shared values in careful, inclusive language. The monarchy's survival, she seemed to recognize, depended on flexibility without abandonment. Whether this approach preserved relevance or merely delayed reckoning remains an open scholarly question. Back home, social change accelerated. Attitudes toward class, gender, and authority evolved rapidly. The world Elizabeth had been born into, formal, hierarchical, deferential, was giving way to something looser, louder, and less patient. She did not chase this change, nor did she confront it directly. She adjusted the pace of the institution, subtly recalibrating without announcing the shift. As you listen now, you might feel how this section carries motion rather than stillness. Movement as duty, travel as listening. Elizabeth's influence during these years did not come from direction, but from endurance, the ability to remain present across difference, to carry the same composure into unfamiliar spaces. These journeys shaped how she understood her role, not as ruler of a fixed realm, but as a steady point within a changing constellation. And as the world continued to turn more quickly, that steadiness would soon be tested closer to home. By the late 20th century, the pace of public life had quickened beyond anything Elizabeth had known in her youth. Technology compressed distance. Television moved from novelty to expectation. Cameras no longer waited for ceremony. They lingered, searching for reaction, for expression, for anything that might reveal more than intended. The monarchy, once buffered by ritual and remoteness, now lived in near constant view. One clear historical fact anchors this era. Televised interviews, live broadcasts, and round-the-clock news transformed how the public related to the royal family. Visibility increased, but understanding did not always follow. Elizabeth watched this shift carefully. She did not resist it outright, nor did she fully embrace it. Instead, she allowed selective openings, controlled moments of access that acknowledged the new world without surrendering to it. Behind the scenes, this required constant recalibration. Speeches were drafted with an awareness that tone could be replayed endlessly. Gestures were examined frame by frame. Silence itself became interpretable. One humanizing detail from this period is her reported irritation with excessive microphones and lighting less from discomfort than from the sense that the presence of machinery disrupted the natural rhythm of conversation. She preferred settings where words could land softly, without amplification. Public expectations evolved alongside media. People wanted warmth, relatability, visible emotion. Elizabeth understood this desire, but approached it cautiously. She had been shaped in an era where composure signaled reliability. Changing too quickly risked destabilizing the very continuity she believed she was meant to protect. Some scholars still ask whether her restraint during these years preserved dignity or widened the gap between institution and public feeling. Within the royal household, these pressures intensified. Family members navigated the spotlight differently, some adapting with ease, others chafing against scrutiny. Elizabeth observed, listened, and intervened sparingly. Her leadership style remained consistent, guide without commanding, correct without confrontation. This approach brought stability, but it also carried cost. Problems left too long can harden. Privately, she continued to retreat into familiar comforts. Walking dogs at dusk, reading quietly after long days, returning to the same routines that had steadied her since childhood. These habits were not nostalgia. They were maintenance ways of preserving equilibrium in a world that demanded constant response. As you rest and listen, you may feel how this chapter carries a subtle tension. The challenge here is not war or politics, but adaptation. How does an institution rooted in centuries of tradition respond to a culture that measures authenticity in seconds? Elizabeth's answer was not swift, it was patient. And whether patience was enough would soon be tested. The pressures that had been building quietly for years finally surfaced in ways that could not be smoothed over by routine alone. For Elizabeth, this period brought challenges that were not diplomatic or constitutional, but deeply personal family storms unfolding under the most unforgiving light of public attention. The careful separation she had long maintained between private life and public duty grew harder to sustain. One clear historical fact marks the strain of this era. The early 1990s saw multiple marital breakdowns within the royal family, played out across headlines and broadcasts with relentless intensity. Elizabeth, who had always valued discretion, watched as intimate difficulties became public property. This was unfamiliar territory. The monarchy had weathered wars and political upheaval, but scrutiny of this kind, constant, personal, and emotionally charged, was new. Behind palace walls, Elizabeth's response remained measured. She listened. She absorbed. She resisted the urge to intervene dramatically. One humanizing detail, often recalled by those close to her, is her habit of reading newspapers later in the day during this period, rather than first thing in the morning, as if pacing her exposure to the noise allowed her to preserve clarity. Silence, once a shield, now required careful timing. The tension lay not only in what was happening, but in how it was interpreted. The public increasingly expected emotional transparency, explanations, apologies. Elizabeth had been shaped to offer steadiness instead. Some biographers still wonder whether she felt misunderstood during these years, or whether misunderstanding was simply accepted as part of the cost of continuity. In 1992, she referred to the year as an annus horribilis, a rare moment of plain-spoken acknowledgement that difficulty had arrived. The phrase was brief, almost understated, yet it carried weight precisely because it departed from her usual reserve. Scholars continue to debate whether this admission marked adaptation or necessity. Was it a conscious step toward openness, or simply an honest moment that could no longer be avoided? Through it all, Elizabeth returned again and again to routine. Work continued. Audiences were held. Papers were read and signed. These acts were not distractions. They were anchors. In maintaining the ordinary, she preserved a sense of order when personal life felt anything but orderly. As you listen now, perhaps you can feel the quiet fatigue that threads through this chapter. Leadership here is not about direction, but endurance, about holding steady when the ground beneath feels less certain. Elizabeth did not resolve these storms with declarations. She outlasted them, trusting that time itself could soften what confrontation might only sharpen. This period left marks, subtle but lasting. It reshaped how the monarchy communicated, how it acknowledged vulnerability, how it prepared for a world that no longer granted distance by default. And as the decade continued, an even more profound test of public feeling would soon arrive, one that would challenge not just the institution, but the very language of grief. When the next storm arrived, it did so with a suddenness that cut through all remaining buffers between the monarchy and public emotion. Grief, when shared by millions at once, moves differently. It is louder, faster, and far less patient with tradition. Elizabeth, who had spent a lifetime mastering restraint, now faced a moment when restraint itself was being questioned. One clear historical fact defines this chapter unmistakably. In 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, died in a car accident in Paris. The news spread with astonishing speed. Radios interrupted programming. Televisions remained on through the night. Outside palace gates, flowers accumulated in quantities no one had prepared for. The country did not merely mourn. It surged. Elizabeth was at Balmoral when the news arrived, surrounded by family, grandchildren included. Her instinct, honed over decades, was to protect the private sphere, to shield the young, to contain emotion until it could be processed safely. She treated the loss first as a family tragedy, not a public one. Some biographers still wonder whether this instinct, so reliable in the past, momentarily placed her out of step with a grieving nation. Public expectations shifted rapidly. Silence, once read as dignity, was now interpreted by many as distance. Flags became symbols. Absence became message. Elizabeth watched this unfold with care, weighing response against precedent. There was no manual for a moment like this, no historical parallel that mapped cleanly onto a media-saturated, emotionally expressive age. One small, human detail often noted from these days is her insistence on maintaining normal routines for her grandchildren at Balmoral walks, meals, familiar structures, believing stability itself was a form of care. This choice, deeply personal, clashed with the public's demand for visible mourning. Scholars continue to debate whether this decision reflected generational difference, maternal instinct, or a belief that leadership sometimes means absorbing criticism rather than reacting to it. Eventually, Elizabeth adjusted. She returned to London. She addressed the nation directly, speaking not as monarch alone, but as grandmother. The tone was careful, sincere, and measured. For many, it provided reassurance. For others, it arrived too late. The divide in perception revealed something new, that timing in the modern world could matter as much as content. This moment marked a subtle recalibration. Elizabeth did not abandon restraint, but she acknowledged the need for connection in different forms. The monarchy's language shifted slightly thereafter, more attentive to public feeling, more responsive to collective emotion, though never fully immersed in it. Whether this change was voluntary or inevitable remains an open question. As you rest and listen, you might feel how this chapter carries the weight of transition, not just for Elizabeth, but for the institution she embodied. The lesson here was not about right or wrong, but about adaptation, about recognizing that continuity sometimes requires change, even when change feels uncomfortable. After this moment, Elizabeth's reign moved into a quieter phase. The storms did not vanish, but they softened. Time, as it often does, slowed the sharpest edges. And Elizabeth, once again, returned to what she knew best: steady presence, patient endurance, and the long view. As the intensity of the late 1990s gradually eased, Elizabeth entered a period that felt less reactive, more reflective. The world had not become simpler, but it had become more familiar in its unpredictability. Having weathered public grief, criticism, and rapid change, she returned to a mode she understood deeply: long attention, measured response, and an acceptance that not every moment required resolution. One clear historical fact frames this stage of her reign. Elizabeth's Golden Jubilee in 2002 marked 50 years on the throne, a milestone few had anticipated when she ascended so young. The year carried both celebration and loss. Within months, she mourned the deaths of her sister Margaret and her mother, two figures who had anchored her private life since childhood. The convergence of public festivity and private grief created a quiet emotional dissonance that she did not attempt to reconcile publicly. In private, the impact was more profound. These losses closed chapters that had begun before the crown ever entered her life. One humanizing detail, often mentioned, is how she kept certain routines unchanged, even in morning continuing daily walks, maintaining scheduled audiences, as if the constancy itself offered comfort. Some biographers still wonder whether this was resilience, or simply the only way she knew how to grieve. Publicly, the Jubilee unfolded with warmth and restraint. Crowds gathered. Music filled streets. Elizabeth appeared on the balcony, as she had so many times before, the image both familiar and quietly astonishing in its longevity. To many, her presence offered reassurance, not because it promised permanence, but because it acknowledged time honestly. She had aged with the nation, visible and unhidden. As the years moved on, Elizabeth's role subtly shifted again. She delegated more, listened more, spoke less. Her authority no longer needed reinforcement. It was assumed. Some scholars argue that this phase represented the purest expression of her leadership style: presence without assertion, continuity without insistence. The question that lingers over these years is gentle, but persistent. How did she understand her own endurance? Was it a burden she carried out of duty, or a vocation that gave her life coherence? Perhaps it was both, intertwined so tightly that separating them would have felt artificial. As you listen now, you may feel the pace beginning to slow. Not because life empties of meaning, but because meaning becomes less crowded. Elizabeth had entered the long middle distance of her reign, where the work was no longer to establish or defend, but simply to remain attentive, available, and quietly constant. With the new century underway, Elizabeth's life settled into a quieter cadence, one shaped less by ambition or adaptation, and more by stewardship. She had outlasted crises, fashions, and predictions of irrelevance. Now, without announcement, she became something rarer, a living measure of time itself. For many, her presence was no longer associated with specific events, but with the comforting sense that something familiar still endured. One clear historical fact anchors this stage. Elizabeth became the longest reigning monarch in British history in 2015, surpassing the record of Queen Victoria. The moment was marked without extravagance. There was no triumphant speech, no overt celebration. Instead, there was a brief acknowledgement, a return to routine, and an insistence that the day remain focused on work. Some biographers still wonder whether she felt pride in that milestone, or whether records, like praise, simply passed through her without lingering. Her public appearances during these years grew more selective, yet no less deliberate. She favored engagements that emphasized continuity rather than novelty. Annual ceremonies, familiar charities, long-standing commitments. One humanizing detail, often noted, is her continued preference for handwritten notes, even as digital communication became the norm. Writing by hand, she seemed to believe, slowed thought to a humane pace. Family life entered a new phase as well. Elizabeth became a grandmother, then a great-grandmother, observing younger generations navigate a world far removed from her own upbringing. She listened more than she advised. Her guidance, when offered, was quiet and contextual, shaped by example rather than instruction. Some scholars still ask whether this restraint reflected trust or a learned understanding that each generation must interpret continuity for itself. Technological change accelerated relentlessly. Smartphones, social media, instant commentary. Elizabeth did not participate directly, but she allowed the institution to acknowledge these shifts carefully. Christmas broadcasts adjusted tone. Messages reached audiences through new channels. The monarchy did not chase relevance, but it no longer ignored it. Whether this balance was intentional or instinctive remains an open question. Privately, her routines remained remarkably consistent. Morning papers, familiar meals, time with animals. These habits did not resist time. They marked it. In repetition, she found grounding. In predictability, rest. As you listen now, you may sense how this stage of her life feels less about action and more about presence, about inhabiting a role so fully that it requires no emphasis. Elizabeth did not slow because she felt finished. She slowed because endurance, at this point, had become its own form of service. And in that slowing, something gentle emerged, the understanding that leadership, sustained long enough, becomes less visible and more deeply felt. As Elizabeth moved deeper into her later years, time itself seemed to gather around her, less as an adversary than as a companion. The pace of her life softened, but the structure remained. Days were shorter, engagements fewer, yet the underlying rhythm, attention, presence, continuity did not change. This was not withdrawal. It was refinement. One clear historical fact marks this period unmistakably. Elizabeth's Diamond Jubilee in 2012 celebrated 60 years on the throne, an achievement so rare that it carried a sense of quiet disbelief. Once again, the milestone was acknowledged without triumph. There were ceremonies, crowds, and music, but her own demeanor remained characteristically measured. Jubilees, she seemed to suggest without saying so, were less about celebration than about witnessing time together. Physically, age made itself known. Walking required more care. Appearances were shorter. Rest was scheduled with intention. Yet Elizabeth resisted the narrative of decline. She did not frame reduced visibility as retreat, but as continuity adapted to circumstance. Some biographers still wonder how much effort it took to maintain this posture, whether acceptance came easily or only after private negotiation. One small, humanizing detail from these years is her fondness for familiar jokes and stories, repeated without embarrassment. What once might have felt redundant now carried comfort. Repetition, for Elizabeth, had never meant stagnation. It meant reassurance. It was a reminder that some things did not need to change to remain meaningful. Publicly, she increasingly symbolized stability itself. In times of political turbulence, her presence offered a visual anchor. She did not comment on events directly, but her continued attendance at ceremonies, memorials, audiences signaled that the framework still held. Some scholars ask whether this symbolic steadiness carried real influence, or whether it simply provided emotional grounding. Perhaps the distinction mattered less than the effect. Privately, loss continued to arrive. Friends and contemporaries faded from her world, narrowing the circle of shared memory. Yet Elizabeth rarely spoke of absence. She moved forward by maintaining connection where possible: letters, calls, small gestures of acknowledgement. Grief for her was not erased by time, but folded into routine. As you listen now, you might feel how this chapter carries a gentler gravity. The drama has quieted. The questions have softened. What remains is presence unadorned, steady, and deeply human. Elizabeth had become not just a participant in history, but a keeper of it, holding decades together simply by remaining. And as the years continued, that presence would soon be tested by a different kind of challenge, one that asked not for ceremony or speech, but for reassurance in a world suddenly paused. The world slowed abruptly, in a way few living generations had experienced. Streets emptied. Familiar routines dissolved. Distance became an act of care. For Elizabeth, whose life had been defined by constancy, this pause carried a strange resonance, both unsettling and deeply familiar. She had lived through war, scarcity, and upheaval before. Stillness, she understood, could be as demanding as motion. One clear historical fact anchors this moment. In 2020, during the global pandemic, Elizabeth delivered a rare special broadcast to the nation. Her words were simple, carefully chosen, and spare. She did not promise quick endings or easy answers. Instead, she spoke of patience, shared effort, and the quiet assurance that separation was not the same as abandonment. Many listeners later said it felt less like a speech and more like a presence entering the room. Privately, these months narrowed her world. Travel ceased. Engagements vanished from the calendar. Even family contact was reduced to what safety allowed. One humanizing detail, often noted, is her reported adjustment to simpler days, fewer changes of setting, longer stretches of quiet something that echoed the wartime routines of her youth. The familiar returned in unexpected ways. Then, in 2021, another loss arrived, this one deeply personal. Prince Philip, her partner of more than 70 years, died after a long life marked by shared purpose and private compromise. The image of Elizabeth sitting alone at his funeral, masked and distanced by necessity, traveled across the world. It spoke without words. Some biographers still wonder how solitude felt in that moment, whether it echoed earlier sacrifices or carried a different, heavier finality. In the months that followed, Elizabeth continued, as she always had. Occurrences resumed cautiously. Messages were delivered when needed. There was no public declaration of grief beyond formality, yet the absence beside her was unmistakable. Routine once again became refuge. Work became structure. Presence became choice. As you listen now, you may feel how this section carries a deep quiet. The narrative thins, not because life loses meaning, but because meaning condenses. Elizabeth's role at this stage was no longer to guide change or even to symbolize endurance alone. It was to demonstrate how one remains, how one continues with care, restraint, and dignity when much has already been given. These were not years of grand gesture. They were years of steadiness under reduction. And in that steadiness, something essential remained visible. The quiet strength of showing up, even when the world feels smaller. The final chapter of Elizabeth's life unfolded without drama, as if in keeping with the tone she had chosen decades earlier. There were no sudden withdrawals, no grand farewells. Instead, there was a gradual narrowing of the circle, fewer journeys, fewer appearances, more time spent in familiar rooms where memory seemed to rest easily on the furniture. One clear historical fact marks this moment with quiet finality. In September 2022, Elizabeth died peacefully at Balmoral Castle, the place she had long associated with rest and distance from formality. The announcement traveled quickly, but the atmosphere it created was slow and heavy. Bells rang. Screens filled with the same photograph. Words like era and end appeared everywhere, as if language itself were trying to stretch far enough to hold what had happened. In the hours that followed, something unusual occurred. The world paused, not in chaos, but in stillness. People gathered without instruction. Flowers appeared in numbers that felt almost instinctive. Many who had never considered her central to their lives found themselves unsettled, unsure what exactly had been lost. Some scholars still ask why her death carried such emotional weight across cultures and generations. Was it affection, habit, or the sudden removal of a long-standing reference point? Elizabeth's final public appearances had been brief but deliberate. She had continued to meet obligations as health allowed, adjusting without announcing the adjustment. One humanizing detail from these last months often mentioned is her preference for being surrounded by familiar faces and routines, rather than medical spectacle. Comfort, at the end, mattered more than display. The transition that followed unfolded with precision, carefully planned, meticulously executed. A new monarch was proclaimed, ceremonies moved forward. And yet, beneath the choreography, there was a collective awareness that something unrepeatable had passed. Elizabeth had not simply occupied a role. She had reshaped how that role felt. Her absence was not noisy. It was spacious. As you listen now, perhaps you can feel how this moment carries both closure and continuation. An ending that does not collapse the structure it leaves behind. A life that concludes not with emphasis, but with quiet completion. Elizabeth had given what she had promised, service measured in time rather than declaration. And as the world adjusted, slowly and imperfectly, her presence lingered not as command or instruction, but as memory. A memory of steadiness, of patience, of a life lived almost entirely in the long view. Long after the formal ceremonies concluded and the crowds dispersed, Elizabeth's presence continued to surface in quieter, less visible ways. Not as a figure in headlines, but as a set of habits expectations, and assumptions woven into everyday life. Her influence did not announce itself. It appeared in patterns, so familiar that many barely noticed them until they were gone. One clear historical fact anchors this continuity. Elizabeth reigned for more than 70 years, spanning eras that transformed technology, politics, and culture beyond recognition. Few institutions, let alone individuals, remain intact across such change. And yet, the systems that surrounded daily civic life still bore her imprint. The language of official statements, the pacing of national rituals, the idea that leadership could be present without being intrusive. These were not abstractions. They were lived realities, shaped over decades. You can still see traces of her influence in how public moments are handled. In the expectation that during uncertainty, someone will speak carefully rather than urgently. In the belief that consistency itself can be reassuring. Even the familiar cadence of televised addresses, measured, deliberate, restrained, owes something to the example she set. She did not invent these forms, but she refined them through repetition. In law and governance, her role was symbolic rather than directive, yet symbolism carries weight. The continuity of constitutional process, parliaments opening, governments forming, transitions occurring without rupture, was reinforced by her steady presence. Some scholars still ask whether this continuity functioned because of her, or merely alongside her. Perhaps the more honest answer is that her presence allowed these processes to feel natural rather than fragile. Culturally, her legacy appears in quieter ways. In the expectation that certain roles are lived rather than performed. In the idea that personal opinion need not always be expressed to be felt. Even in everyday language, phrases like carry on, keep calm, or do your duty. The values she embodied echo faintly, less as instruction than as tone. One humanizing detail often overlooked is how her personal habits mirrored this broader influence. Her preference for routine, her comfort with repetition, her belief that small, consistent actions mattered more than dramatic gestures. These were not strategies. They were ways of living that, over time, shaped how others understood stability. In modern life, where immediacy is often prized above patience, her example stands in quiet contrast. She showed that not everything needs resolution at once, that some responsibilities unfold over lifetimes, that meaning can accumulate slowly without announcement. Some biographers still wonder whether this approach would be possible for someone beginning now, or whether it belonged uniquely to her era. As you listen, perhaps you notice how this legacy feels less like a lesson and more like an atmosphere. Something sensed rather than stated. Elizabeth's life did not demand imitation. It offered a reference point, a way of understanding time, service, and presence that remains available, even as the world moves faster. Her influence persists not because it insists, but because it endures, in habits, in expectations, in the quiet assumption that steadiness has value. And as these traces continue to surface in ordinary moments, they remind us that some lives do not end when they conclude. They simply settle, becoming part of the background against which others move. As the story of Elizabeth's life gently approaches its end, the pace naturally softens. There is less to explain now, fewer facts that need arranging. What remains is space to feel how a single life, lived steadily for so long, slowly releases its hold on time. In her final years, Elizabeth no longer stood at the center of events. She became, instead, their quiet edge. Decisions were made around her, voices moved past her, and yet, her presence continued to lend shape to the room. Like a familiar piece of furniture, you no longer notice until it's gone. One clear historical fact completes the arc. She served as monarch until her death, never stepping away from the role she had accepted as a young woman. There was no retirement, no closing chapter written in advance, only continuation, right up to the end. Those close to her often described her final period not as one of sadness, but of narrowing. Fewer places, fewer people, fewer demands. Balmoral, in particular, offered a gentler rhythm air that felt less formal. Days marked by weather and routine rather than schedule. One small, human detail remembered from this time is her continued interest in the everyday. The condition of the ground after rain, the comfort of familiar rooms, the presence of animals nearby. These details mattered more than ceremony. Looking back, biographers still ask a quiet, unresolved question. Did Elizabeth feel complete? Not satisfied in a dramatic sense, but at peace with the shape her life had taken. The records do not answer. Perhaps they cannot. Some things are only known inwardly, and Elizabeth had always kept that inward space carefully protected. As you listen now, you may notice how the paradox from the beginning begins to settle. A life built on restraint became deeply personal, not because it revealed everything, but because it revealed enough, consistently, over time. Presence replaced explanation. Continuity replaced confession, and somehow that was enough. Elizabeth's life does not conclude with a moral or a directive. It ends the way it was lived, quietly, steadily, without insisting on interpretation. What you take from it is your own, and what remains is not instruction, but a feeling, a sense that patience, carried long enough, becomes its own kind of legacy. You don't need to hold the dates, the places, or the names anymore. Let them drift, like papers being gently gathered and set aside at the end of a long day. What remains is the rhythm, the slow, even rhythm of a life lived in continuity. Elizabeth's story doesn't rush toward sleep. It settles into it. Like a house at night, lights gradually dimmed room by room. The weight of responsibility, once so present, becomes lighter when seen from a distance. You may notice your own breathing now unhurried, steady, matching that same long rhythm. Think of time not as something pressing forward, but as something wide and calm, holding moments without asking them to hurry. A life can move through decades this way. So can a night. If thoughts arise, let them pass without following them. If memories surface, let them soften at the edges. There is nothing more you need to learn right now. Nothing to resolve. Just rest. The story has reached a natural pause. And like Elizabeth herself, it leaves quietly without announcement, without urgency, trusting that continuity will take care of the rest. Sleep can come when it's ready.